Action Research 1, and this is video 6. Okay, we were talking about the 3 E's of data collection strategies: experiencing, inquiring, and examining. And we're going to look at each one of those in a little bit more detail now. Experiencing, for that particular category, first the data must be gathered through your own experience. This category focuses on observational data that may be recorded in various ways. You may have field notes. That's a common data collection strategy where you record what is going on during an observation. It can include description of places, such as locations, physical layouts, for example, or people, individuals, types, positions, for example, objects, buildings, furniture, equipment, materials, acts, a single action that people take, for instance, or activities or sets of related acts, maybe events, sets of related activities within the whole setup. Or it might be purposes. What are people trying to accomplish? It might be the time, the frequency, the duration, the sequencing of all of it. It might involve feelings, emotional orientations, and responses. So you can see there's the whole idea of experiencing, and I hope you can kind of draw that in about all the different things you could experience when you're thinking of how you'd collect that data. For inquiring, this particular strategy for data collection is asking you to respond in some manner. The participants, not you. You would be asking them to respond in some manner. Inquiring of them, and this is E-N-Q-U-I-R-I-N-G, not I-N. The most common action research strategy for collecting inquiring data is through interviews. So you know that that's used quite often. You have large, or called grand tour questions that are very global, which might be something like asking the students or teachers or whoever it is that you're talking to describe something in their own terms. It might be something like, tell me about your school. And then within that, you would end up breaking it down into smaller bits as you were talking with them. You might then ask them to describe how something typically happens, such as describe a typical science class. You might have specific questions that ask about specific events or activities. Tell me about what happened in science class yesterday. Guided tour questions, where we talked about the grand tour questions, which are the very large, overarching, wide open. But the guided tour questions might ask the students, for example, for an actual tour while providing details about the people and activities in the setting, such as, can you show me around the playground? And in discussing that as you were walking, again, the details about who's that and why are they doing this, and the activities, what's happening here out on the playground. You also might have task-related questions that aid in description, such as, can you draw me a map or a picture of that? Then if you took those questions into another stage or phase outside of that grand tour, would be extension questions or mini tour questions. It doesn't matter if you remember the terms grand tour or mini tour or any of that. It's just helping you figure out ways to keep refining your data collection. It might be then about, can you tell me more about that? It might be that you take it even further to prompt questions, where you're asking more detail. What else can you tell me about that? You might be in encouragement questions or statements or things like, please go on, yes. Example questions, do just what the name implies. Ask for a specific example. Can you give me an example of that? The next part is examining, of the third ways of the 3 E's. Data can be collected through examining artifacts and other materials that already exist or that are routinely collected in the setting. Student records and teacher records are most useful sources of information for that. Something that comes to mind instantly for me is tax scores or demographics or gender of students, all kinds of things that would help you then maybe break down your question or what you're collecting. Going back to Mr. Rodriguez, let's talk about him for a minute. Remember, he had noticed that students that he was teaching in his social study class were bored, and he wondered what instructional strategies he might use to engage them. He could briefly examine the literature on student engagement, find a couple of sources about that. He could make written observations about student behavior in his class to determine if there is a pattern. He could individually interview students, and we talked about that earlier, and ask them to describe their experiences in social studies. He might videotape the class to observe his own teaching practices and the students' responses to what he was doing. He might conduct focus groups with the students to ask about their interests and their experiences in school. And then based on all that data he had collected, he might try some different instructional strategies and see if those demonstrated more engagement with the students. Again, determining if that was the case. Remember the cycle for action research. We want to talk just a really brief thought on rigor, and which talks about the quality of your research. You want to make sure it's valid, if there's validity, and that's really making sure your results are accurate in what you've learned in your results. The process validity, in that you use appropriate processes to study the problem. There's other kinds of validity, and we're not going to go into the technicalities of all of that, but you would want to make sure that what you've come up with is on track. Ethics in action research also, we want to talk about very briefly. The primary concern for action research is it's often more open-ended than the other types of researches that come to a very definite conclusion. Remember, the cycle is different for action research. It may change as you have different focuses as you come to the problem in the cycles. You may start off here, and by the time you've gone through that, you come at it from a totally different direction. There's little distance between the researcher, which would be you in the school setting, and your subjects, which would be the students in your classroom. You want to make sure that you have your principal on board with what you're doing. This should not be something done on the QT. You want to make sure that they know exactly what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the purpose, the underlying purpose besides a college course is that hopefully you're really trying to learn something about what you're researching. You may need to think about parental consent and see what the principal thinks about that. Does the principal think you need to ask all the parents of your students in your class if it's okay that you do this? If that is the case and you need to do that, you might write a generic letter with these 4 key points: that I'm conducting research for myself that is intended to benefit the students in my class. The research will not mean different things will happen to some of the children. Nothing will be granted or denied due to the research. You don't have a placebo. You're just observing what's happening, and you may use the children's work or their words or ideas in reporting on the research. And finally, that there will be no negative consequences if permission is denied. And if that is the case, then any data for that particular student, then you would just not use that in the study. So make sure everybody's on board with you as you go into that. That's the end of this one.